and we can talk about our budget process in RSU 13 for this workshop. Again, the idea being that for those of us who've been here for a while, getting another reboot on sort of the budget and how it works, and our timing is great, but for new folks, of course, really, really good. And we're all on the same page as we enter this budget season. Before we get going though, I just want to say something else. And that is that I don't know if anyone on our staff is watching or listening, but in case that you are, we just can't tell you how much we appreciate everything you do every single day. We can't imagine how hard it is to do your job. And we want you to know how much we appreciate that you are doing it and that you are sticking with it. And that you are doing it within the pressure that you probably never imagined could have happened in your professional lives. And we also know that the pandemic and everything about it has been stressful for you and everybody, and also our kids, our students, and that they may show that pressure and that stress in different ways that is also challenging for you. And we just recognize that fact and recognize that you have to put in extra effort when you're probably really, really, really tired, really tired. I think you and healthcare workers have seen it the most and felt it the most and had to work the hardest of all of us. And I just, again, cannot thank you enough for all the work that you're doing and committing yourself and your lives to our students and your work. I also want to say that I know that it may seem hard sometimes to see us as a school board meeting online, but like I've said to many people, we can do our work online. We don't need to be there in the same room. You need to be there for our kids. They desperately need you and your presence and the presence of their classmates to feel whole and healthy and moving forward. And so that's why we are temporarily as a school board meeting online. I'm really hoping that maybe even by our next meeting, we can be back in person, but as soon as we can, we will do that. But again, we thank you for, again, your dedication for being there for our kids every single day and getting through all of this, which we most certainly will. John, do you want to say anything to start this off tonight, or you want to get right over to Pete?
Well, Peter has worked hard to prepare this presentation tonight. He's going to go through it for the bulk of the meeting. There may be times when I chime in with this and that or answer a question, but without any further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Pete, and he can begin.
Thank you. So the transition from Lauren's statement, this is the part where the school board actually funds and supports all of us in terms of providing us resources. That's what the budget does. It really is turning the goals of the board, the needs of the school system and staff, and providing the resources. So this idea of coming up with a kind of an overview of the budget process was kind of started with Chelsea wanting to help the new board members understand the process. And we started with the idea that we would do presentations about each one of our articles. So, for those who have been around, we have regular instruction and special ed instruction in our budget that we categorize. But new board members, as well as a lot of the public, probably really doesn't understand why we do that. And so this is where that started from. As I was putting it together and thinking about it over the last couple of weeks, it's kind of grown so that the pieces that we were talking about in finance to put together for presentations is at the end of this. And so I have some information kind of leading up to that I think is even kind of sets the stage for the budget process and kind of gives everybody kind of an overview of what the finances at the district look like in terms of spending and receiving money. I did have a fun game that I was going to hope to play with everybody that I did as part of my school certificate program, school finance certificate program with Georgetown. I just don't think it's going to work as well over Zoom as it would be in person, but it did involve everybody getting hats and crowns
I am
principals,
bummed.
and everybody has a role, will have a role when we do this, because I think it's good. I think it actually would be a great learning tool.
I
for,
love
a
silly
lot of
hats.
us. And then we get kind of budget cards that we spread out, and we actually, each one has a scenario to, this one says teaching, it doesn't add or subtract from the budget, but it restructures the school day to provide 60 additional minutes of collaboration planning. So there's different things to affect the budget. Each one affects the percent of the budget. And the goal is that as a group of different people with different goals in different positions to come up with ideas to meet a budget goal, which might be reduce the budget by 2% or 3%, or be flat, or increase instruction time, or decrease or increase professional development time. It'll be fun to do at some point, but I just didn't want to do it over Zoom, and so something
We'll
to
do
look
it
forward to.
sometime.
So I'm going to share my screen with the presentation. Some of the slides are kind of clunky. We're going to not go through every single one in detail. It's not meant for that. I can see all of you. I've got a couple screens. So
Pete, do you want people to stop you and ask questions when they have them, or wait until a pause that you have, or what do you want people to do?
nope. If you want to, what I was going to say is, if you want to raise your hand or kind of just get my attention, I can see you because I have a couple screens going. If I ignore you, it's probably because I don't see you. So just chime in. There's no real flow to this that is going to, that needs to be maintained. I'm happy to stop and answer questions as we go. So let me start the sharing. That one. And so let me know if you see the screen that I hope you're seeing.
Yep. See it.
Okay. And it's clear.
Yes.
All right. All right. Budget process. So the first thing I wanted to kind of, when I was doing this, was thinking, let's kind of start from beginning and wonder and ask where does all our money come from, and where does it all go? And this kind of came up the other night in our audit when David asked a question, because our total expenditures was much more than what he was expecting them to be in our audit. Instead of $30 million, it was almost $40 million. So that kind of made me think that there's a little, there's an area there that, not everybody understands that there's much more to our finances in the district than just the general fund, which is what we spend so much time talking about and reviewing and budgeting and forecasting and then auditing at the end of the year. So on the left-hand side, you can see in millions of dollars. This is our total expenditures in the district over the last 6 years. You can see that our budget, our total expenditures is anywhere from, really nowadays, is between $35 and $40 million in terms of everything that we spend. General fund, you can see that when we first borrowed money for the expansion of the high school and middle school, as well as building the new Ash Point School, that was in fiscal 18. A lot of that expenses went on. So you can see we spent almost $50 million that year. There was, and prior to this year, prior to fiscal 16, there was another $8 million that we spent on infrastructure with the project for the boilers and the energy projects. So this is kind of, you can see, the bulk is clearly in the general fund, but there is a lot of other areas of funds that we spend money in. And this is just a partial list of those funds. They're sorted by the type of fund, with the general fund being the biggest fund that we spend money out of over the last 6 years. But what a fund is, each one of these funds is its own separate business. So we run every single fund with its own profit and loss statement, with its own balance sheet, with its own fund balance. And we do it out of one checking account. So each one of these funds goes back and forth and owes each other money all the time. But each one needs to be treated very differently. The ones that begin with 2 are mostly grant funds and mostly federal funds. And those have a lot more requirements in terms of purchasing and procurement. It has a lot more in terms of record keeping for payroll. So each one has its own set of rules and regulations. But you can see it's not quite as simple as just having one simple general fund. And this is the one that we spend our time focusing on with the budget. In addition, there's a small piece down here, which is the adult education general fund budget, which you can see is much smaller amount. It's about $200,000 a year versus the $30 million for the general fund. But again, each one of these is part of that. Nutrition being our second biggest fund in terms of ongoing fund. But I just want to kind of give you an idea that it is much more complex than just this one single fund. This is the spending by fund, but I've just taken out the general fund and the futures fund just to kind of show you where some of our bigger, smaller funds are, if that makes sense. You can see nutrition, Title I, LE is local entitlement, our special ed supplemental fund. And then you can see now in fiscal 21, we're starting to see some big spending in CRF1 and CRF2, and that'll continue in fiscal 22 and fiscal 23.
Peter,
Because there is
question.
Yep.
The funds, how many of those do we raise out of taxes? No, of
2.
the adult ed and general?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, nutrition is also raised out of taxes,
We raise a portion of that.
part of it. Yeah.
So we raise the expected deficit of that, in the general, but it's raised generally in the general fund. Historically, it has been the general fund. Same information, all funds, just different representation for those that like pie charts as opposed to stack charts. And again, the same information without general fund and without the futures fund. That's kind of an overview of just where that $35 to $40 million is being spent. And you can see if you look, there are just lots of little funds that we have to maintain and track and reconcile, and they are all audited. And actually, in some of these smaller funds, there are actually subgroups of funds in some of these. For example, each school we have one grant fund, and each school has a sub fund, and each school in that has more funds within it. So each one gets grants. So we have to kind of it's quite the kind of a tangled web of money, but we reconcile it all and it all works out at the end. They're all balanced at 0 by the end of the year. So now we're going to go back and kind of talk about the general fund. So this is really where we spend our time. This is where the board spends its time and its focus. The board does learn about it and is told about through reports all of our federal funds. There's once a year that Stephanie will present the Title I and Title V grants awards. They're not required to be presented in this way because they're not known. The amounts are generally never known through the budget process for the next year. So when the application is submitted and approved, that's when Stephanie will come out and inform the board as to what that looks like. We do get authorization to receive and spend that money through the budget process If you remember, there's an article that says that we're authorized to expend grant funds. And that's what that's about. Where does the money go? So in the general fund, this are the kind of the major categories of our spending. And you can see salaries and benefits together represent 78% of our spending. The next highest is debt and miscellaneous, which is mostly field trips and other smaller amounts, but that's primarily debt, is 6.5%. A little deceiving because a large portion of the debt that we have to account for is the debt that was approved by the voters for Midcoast School of Technology. So a portion of that number is MCST in the new building. But the rest of it is generally the debt that we've incurred and that voters have approved separately. So it's treated separately because the voters have approved it separately. We just carry the payment each year in that category. Property services is anything from utilities to snow plowing. Supplies is really, that's both instructional supplies, vehicle supplies, facility supplies. Professional services, again, these are smaller categories, but you can see the really the biggest piece of this. If you're looking at 84 to 85% of this is really up here, and given the status quo staffing level, that's fairly fixed. When you get into utilities and building costs, some of that is somewhat fixed too. So there's a limited amount of things that we can do outside staffing to make a big impact on the budget. We've also moved a lot of, we've increased our debt service over the last 7 years. It was actually quite low and lower than you would want it to be in some cases. And what I mean by that is I consider debt, especially the way we've been spending it on upgrading our infrastructure, as an alternative cost to facilities costs. So to me, I look at debt and facilities costs together, because when we increased our debt as a district, we drastically decreased our facility costs. We closed buildings. We made them much more efficient with new boilers and backup boilers. We lost a lot of square footage when we closed Lower Liberty, when we closed part of South School, when we didn't lose square footage, but we have more efficient square footage when we combined the Owl's Head School and the Gopher Butler School into the Ash Point School. So in terms of what we pay per square footage for the district, we pay for fewer square feet, and we pay less per square foot in our facilities, and that's kind of been offset by the increase in debt, which decreases every year because the interest payment actually decreases every year.
A question here, actually. So for things like some of our software programs like iReady and the programs that Stephanie always presents to us, and also for the iPads, where do they fall under these categories?
The iPads themselves?
Yeah.
They would be under instructional equipment. So they'd be, used to be under, property. So generally any of the assets, any additional assets would be considered property. So the payment on those would be property. They will be actually coded based on new DOE and federal guidance that they'll actually recode it as supplies. They've had a different threshold. But that's where they show up. Software would be in, I believe, under professional and technical services. If I don't.
Thanks.
The next way I've kind of broken out our spending is in a way by our budgeting structure, at least a piece of it. So there's some major kind of subcoding that the DOE demands that we use, and that's actually really just, they're just passing along what the federal government uses. Every school system in the country, public school system, uses this kind of coding. It kind of differentiates these 5 major areas of spending. You can see overhead is our number 1 cost. And if you look to the right, you'll see what overhead actually includes, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. Some of those things don't feel like overhead. They feel like more instruction. Student staff support, which is everything from nursing to guidance to social work to professional development to technology. That's included in overhead. The principal's office and the superintendent's office and my office are all overhead. Transportation, facilities, and debt are all overhead. Regular instruction is generally what we call Article 1 in the budget. It's primary and secondary education and also pre-K. Special services is really entirely what we look at as Article 2 in special ed. Then you can see the smaller groups are Midco School Technology has its own. We pay them. That's the portion that we pay for just the programming, not the debt. Actually, this one does include the debt, I believe. Other regular is also part of Article 1, but it's broken out separately. It's gifted and talented program, the alternative ed programs, the English language learner programs, and now with after school, and also includes our summer regular ed program that we offer at the high school, not the special ed summer program that would be under special services. On to revenue. So first, one slide, this is all funds. Then I'll go back to just general fund. If you consider all of our funds, that the $35 to $40 million, you can see the percentage and the big difference that you'll see between this and the next iteration of this is where you'll see the federal grants represent almost 10% of our income for the district. We also, and this is a 6-year total. So this kind of puts all the 6 years together. We've used our fund balance as revenue. So what that means is that when we underexpend our budget and we have money left over, it's been the practice in the past when we had the ability to do so, to put that money back towards the budget and reduce the taxpayer impact. We also used it, especially during the construction process, because we knew that we were going to save money and we were paying for a lot of the new debt by savings, but the expense came before the savings. So to mitigate that delay in the savings, we use fund balance to temper that and to spread it out over time.
Question on tuition.
Yep.
How many students do we have tuition in?
About 34.
That counts 2% of our funds.
Excuse me?
So tuition's 2%, is that right? Or am I missing?
2% over the last 6 years, yes.
On average, 2% per year.
2% of the total over 6 years.
Okay, good.
So it's not an average. But we do every one of these years did include tuition. So It's,
How much do we charge for tuition?
we charge what the state allows us to charge. There's a formula that allows, that puts together tuition, and what they do is they take your prior year's expenditures, certain expenditures, not including special ed, not including transportation, not including debt service. And they divide that by your student population of 2 years ago, I believe. It's not the same year. They don't compare the same year. And they figure out what that average cost per student is for your district, for every district. And then they figure out what the average is as the state as a whole. And by statute, unless both sides agree to do something different, you can only charge the lower of the state average or your tuition rate.
What
And
is-
generally, the state average is always less than our tuition rate. So we generally are charging less than our cost as calculated by the DOE.
What is that for this year?
So it's anywhere from, for high school, it's about $11,000 per student. For elementary, it's about $9,500 per student. If you search on Google or any search engine for DOE tuition, you can go right to those spreadsheets for every single year, and you can see what those numbers are.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
I had a question as well. So this gets a little complicated, so I'm going to try to express it clearly, but feel free to provide some more context if you think people need it. But so our special ed funding comes partially from our local taxes, but there's the federal IDEA law, which governs special ed. And as part of that, we're supposed to be getting a certain percentage of our special ed covered. And I know that gets trickled down from the federal government to the state and then gets trickled down a little bit further. And I was curious if you can piece out how that happens in this chart, or if it just gets so muddled that there's no way to really tell how much we get.
It gets muddled, but I can kind of go through a little bit. So first, the IDEA and the local entitlement grant is, we showed that earlier. It was one of our larger revenue sources and expenditure sources, but federal grants can't be used to supplant local spending. You can't use federal money to offset what you should be spending locally. It can only be used to supplement local spending for additional needs for the population that the grant is geared towards. In terms of our special ed reimbursement and what the state is supposed to be getting from the feds is one part of that law, which is much less than the law states. So the state is only getting, I think if the number stands out as about 11% of the special ed spending that they and they should be getting 30%. I know Senator Collins every year makes a big point about trying to get that increased every year, and has been successful. The other part of that is the state is supposed to be reimbursing us for a substantial portion of our special ed costs, which they've made big strides in doing. And I believe it's about 55%, or between 50 and 55% is what they should be reimbursing us for our special ed costs. As an RSU, and as any district, the way they do that is through the EPS formula. So they put those costs into the formula, and then they calculate subsidy. And we'll kind of go through that a little bit later, which is helpful for towns that receive subsidy, but not for towns that don't. So for example, Owl's Head gets no benefit from special ed costs in the formula because they don't get subsidy because they have the ability to raise the taxes based on their property value that the other towns don't. For example, for a community like Northport or like St. George, who doesn't get subsidy, they're low receivers, kind of like what Owl's Head is, that no subsidy. There's a circuit breaker that actually says after they calculate the entire EPS formula and they determine that St. George or Northport does not get any subsidy, they then go back to the special ed piece of that and they actually add on half of their expenses and give it back to them in subsidy. So they actually get that subsidy no matter what. Owl's Head being part of an RSU doesn't get that same circuit breaker, nor do any of the towns. So we actually don't get the full effect of the 50 or 55% reimbursement because some towns aren't getting their full share. Owl's Head's one of them. Cushing for many years didn't get a lot of it. I'm not sure if they're getting all of it right now. South Thomaston doesn't get all of it. Rockland and Thomaston do, but it's a nuance and a very unfair part of the EPS formula and part of what I call the RSU marriage tax in the EPS formula. There are a lot of pieces of the EPS formula that tend to discriminate against RSUs as opposed to wealthier towns that don't get any subsidy. So I guess bottom line, we do get some of it back, not the full amount, and it's done through the subsidy piece of that. So you really can't break it out quite easily. Now, general funds. And so there's a couple pieces of revenue. The first is as part of the EPS formula, and in order to get subsidy from the state, each town must raise a certain amount of money to qualify for that subsidy. And that's what they call the required local. Well, first let me back up a little bit. This is the same. This is that first pie chart with just the general fund. So you can see that the towns are by far the largest contributor to our budget, with the state being a smaller piece of that. Okay, required local. So each town and city must raise a certain amount of money in order to qualify to receive subsidy based on a formula that doesn't determine the cost of education, just determines a baseline that they can apply to all districts around the state and try to make it somewhat equivalent in terms of a basis, a starting point. This is done solely on student count, the prior year student count. So whatever percent of the district students your town has or city, that's the percent of the required local that the town must raise in order to qualify for subsidy. The required local last year or this year was about $21 million. And this is how it's broken out. And these numbers are straight from the reports that we send them on student counts. And this is represent, that in this example, 45% of all of our students come from Rockland, live in Rockland. The next part is I didn't to a slide. I think it's probably needs its own kind of presentation. What they do is they want to say, can this town afford to raise that amount of money? And so if 45% of, let's say, $20 million is $9 million, that's Rockland's share of required local. How can Rockland afford that? Can Owl's Head afford 2 million? Can Cushing afford 2 million? Can South Thompson afford 2 million? What they do is they create a mill rate that's arbitrary, but it's a mill rate that when they figure out the relationship between the total money for education and the total value of property in the state, balances their budget. In this case, they say that no town should have to raise more than 7.4 mils for required local education. And then they apply that to every single community. For example, Rockland, based on its valuation, can only afford 6 million, for example. That 6 million would get them to a 7.4 mil rate. So what they say now is if Rockland's required local is 9 million, but they can only afford to pay 6 million. And when they say afford to pay, they mean have the tax base to pay, not the income to pay it. The state says, well, we'll kick in that extra $3 million on behalf of Rockland to the school system. And that's how the subsidy is calculated. So for Rockland's $9 million of required local, they can only afford to pay 6, and the state kicks in the other 3. That's done for every single community. Right now, every community gets a little bit because they all hit that 7.4 mil rate based on the required local, except for Cushing, except for Owl's Head. Owl's Head, their required local of 2 million only represents about 6 mils or 5.5 mils. So they don't get to that. They don't get to that threshold where the state helps them out. It just means that they see the full impact of every single increase in spending. Any questions on that?
No, that was really well explained. Well done.
I agree, but can you comment on the 28% Maine stat that you have on the other slide?
How can you see that?
Sorry, I had mine open. I didn't realize
Oh.
I didn't realize you had jumped ahead.
Geez,
Or I had
good.
jumped ahead and you had not.
I
Sorry.
thought I had the wrong screen going because I got them both on the other screen. So what this does, this adds the main component in. So now, using the same scenario, so Rockland's $6 million now represents 6% or 29% of the full $20 million. So in terms of the required local now, Rockland's only picking up 29% of that because Maine's picking up a portion of that for Rockland. Maine's picking up a portion for Owl's Head, for Thomaston, for South Thomaston. The amount they're picking up is in the parentheses here. This is the difference from the previous slide to this slide. So Cushing's, in terms of the overall, raising of local taxes. It's not a number that I look at, but I think it's interesting to show that it does reduce the required local for communities that that may need it. I still think it's not enough, but it's something. And then this is the amount that would be kind of the hybrid between the two. So this is this is based on the 15 million that's raised locally as opposed to 20 million. So if you take out the state part, this is how the percentages change. Again, probably not that useful, but something that we look at. But you can see that with subsidy and based on the 15 million that actually is raised locally, as opposed to the subsidy part of it, Rockland now is raising 41% of that 15 million, which is less than their student count. So you can see kind of the impact. It does help them pay less than they would be expected to pay as a percentage, given their percent of students. And this kind of goes through, and each one represents the required local of each town by a percent. It doesn't recognize the numbers, but you can see the state pays 2% of Cushing's required local, 35% of Rockland's, 43% of Thomaston's, and 16% of South Thomaston's. A couple years ago, that was 0 Cushing, 0 Owlshead, 0 South Thomaston, and probably 28% Rockland and about 35% Thomaston. So they are picking up a larger share of these towns, and towns that didn't get subsidy in the past are now getting it. This is the comparable screen when you look at towns that are in southern Maine and you look to see what kind of subsidy they're getting as a percent of their required local. Things look many people are happy with this number. You know, Rockland's getting over a third of their required local paid for with subsidy. But when a town like Yarmouth or wealthy towns with lower property values get a higher percentage, it's frustrating. So that's why I think that, and the formula itself is fine. It's how they distribute the funds that I have a problem with, that I think that towns like ours, R5, are under subsidized. And because it's a zero-sum game, it's still the same budget from the federal, from the Maine for education. In order for us to get more subsidy, somebody else has to get less. And politically, it's hard. Funding formulas on the state level usually get turned around and changed every 15 to 20 years. It's that hard to change a funding formula, but maybe it's time. The second piece, so clearly the $20 million of required local doesn't cover our budget. So we have to raise additional local funds in order to pay for things like small schools, gifted and talented programs, high quality teaching positions, multiple schools in multiple communities that the EPS formula does not kind of take into account for. And so these are called additional local funds. And additional local funds is a formula that's determined locally. The formula that was determined by MSAD 5 and MSAD 50 when they merged to form the RSU, created a formula where the additional local was based on a weighting system that weighted students and valuation. So they use the 3-year average of students by town and the 3-year average valuation by town. They give students a 25% weight and they give valuation a 75% weight. And it's meant to kind of offset or be kind of a contrary style calculation than the state formula, which just uses students. So this adds the valuation piece into it as part of the formula, where the state only uses valuation as kind of a test to see what you can afford to pay with your tax base. I've got my own opinions on whether valuation is actually an accurate way of assessing or distributing this, but that's what we are. So this is what we do. This represents the upper left is the percentage of students by town over the last 3 years. And the right side is the three-year average valuation by town. You can see that, whereas Owl's Head students represent 9%, Owl's Head valuation represents 18%. And you can start to see why Owl's Head is not getting the subsidy that other towns might be. Down below is the mix, and so this is how we then distribute the additional local amount of money that we have to raise in our budget using that mixed formula. So this represents that weighted average between the two. And so with a $32 million budget and 21 million is required local, about $1 million is raised locally in terms of whether it be fees or tuition or other things that don't require a tax input. The other 11 million is what we raise, and how we distribute that 11 million is using these percentages. And that's kind of how we take the required local and the additional local and add those two amounts up using these formulas and come up with what each town is required to raise from their taxpayers over the next budget year. And this kind of puts those two required local on the left, additional local on the right. This is a little bit bigger. You can see that the numbers and the percentages are what is done after subsidy. And then the number on the right is the weighted formula. Any questions on that? It's not easy. It changes constantly, especially using averages, and because the state changes the way they report numbers every year, so it's hard to. We actually have to go to the valuations on the main revenue services website to determine that every year, and then we have to go back and determine what the state has used for its student numbers every year, which need to be verified, and then make sure they make sense with prior years when I do my calculations.
Pete, what do you want our takeaways to be on that? What would you say we should really focus on as our takeaways?
I really just want to set up the terminology and the framework for the board to ask questions when we get to that part of the budget. I guess it's more about just kind of, introducing everybody to the fact that it's much more that goes into determining what each community pays as a percentage of our budget than just students, than just valuation, then clearly doesn't include income or any other kind of affordability. It doesn't include free and reduced lunch. It doesn't include a lot of things, but it does include percentage of pupils, which I think is appropriate, and valuation. And I just want that context to be kind of understood as we go into the budget season and we start kind of distributing the money in the budget, and why towns and cities, their percentage might change year to year. It's hard to understand that even if the budget did not increase by $1, the amount that each community would contribute to the budget in that next year could be very different based on people moving into the community, moving out of community, high valuations based on a manufacturer, low valuations based on something closing. They saw a lot of a lot of things, happened when paper mills closed, in Bucksport. When they lost a paper mill, the valuation of Bucksport went down substantially. So there are a lot of factors that are out of the control of the school system that impact the changes in a community's percentage of contribution to a budget. We've seen towns that, we think, would normally pay less because maybe they have a student population decrease in a certain town, yet they're paying more because the valuation in the town has increased to the point where they get less subsidy. So I guess that's the takeaway for me from this piece of that is it's complicated. There's a lot of other factors, but also question everything. If something looks wrong, there's a lot of calculations going into this, and a mistake can be made, and nothing that hasn't been overcome. We couldn't overcome yet, but and nothing that's been substantial. But the calculations, I double, triple check, and I look at these numbers again, and they look wrong to me, and I do it again, and they're not. But again, it's a stressful part of the budget process for me, because I'm putting on paper, and you're signing your name to it, what each community needs to pay for education that following year, and we're kind of demanding that payment from them. So it's an important piece of the budget process, and it shouldn't be overlooked, or just kind of, if there's a question, if something doesn't look right, ask questions with anything.
Okay, thank you.
So this is where this whole idea started with, actually, what's the legal responsibility? What do we legally need to do for a budget? And so this is where where Chelsea and I first started talking about what is the board's responsibility, what is the RSU's responsibility, and by statute to boost the budget. Clearly, it's the board's responsibility to prepare a budget, and this is the statute that it falls under. It's 20A, like all of our education statutes. But the board must prepare a budget annually for operational cost, bonds falling due, interest on bonds, rentals, loans like the trans that we, and they must distribute that budget to the voters, because they're the legislative body responsible for a final budget approval at least 7 days prior to the approval. And the approval for us, for our budget, is at the annual budget meeting. This is the format that we're required to use when we put together a budget. And we'll come back to this. We'll kind of go through each one of these to show you what's in it in a second. But these are called cost centers. So it's a cost center summary budget. We call it articles, because each one of these cost centers, regular instruction, special ed, each one represents an article on the referendum that the voters, or that this budget meeting votes on. So if you've been to a budget meeting, you'd recognize each one of these, because each one of these has a dollar amount that's recommended by the board and then voted on at the budget meeting by the voters that are there. This is something that's new for next year, and it's worth noting. Whether it's enforced or not, that's kind of been up in the air, because it doesn't take into account a lot of things. So what the law says is that our budget needs to be presented in a way where 70% of the budget is in basically Articles 1, 2, 3, and 4. Ours is not near that. Ours is probably in the high 50% level, if I recall doing this last year when I checked it. And the reason why it's not really fair to use this number, because different districts have different amounts of debt. Rural districts have higher transportation costs. Districts with smaller schools have more facility costs. So as a percentage, it's the target of 70 is somewhat arbitrary. So that's why it sounds to me like it's not going to be something that they're going to be using or testing when we put our budgets through. But it's something to keep in mind that the legislature was looking at this as a goal to focus on these first 4 student-centered articles and making sure that the budgets represent a vast, money towards that.
Can you talk a little bit about that more? Because actually it's the first time I'm hearing about it. So I'm curious about just what is the mechanism that they're using to enforce it? And yeah, just what is the process that they're hoping? And then what is the process that we have currently that we need to meet for this budget cycle?
So your guess is as good as mine. There is no process. There is no enforcement. I think it's something that they still need to go back and rethink and adjust. So I'm not sure many districts could accomplish this.
Are they planning to do that?
I don't know. I haven't seen it on the agenda yet. Again, that was more just to kind of have the board aware of what may be coming at some point. Or if you read something about it, that's what it refers to. The revenue that needs to be determined or disclosed on part of the budget is the total cost of the education. Anything that's non-state funded for debt service. So so all of our debt service that's been approved by voters in a prior referendum. And then we have to outline all the additional local funds that we are raising as part of the budget. And then the summary budget is part of that process. So this just kind of outlines what we have to present to our budget meeting. Next is kind of the process which the board begins, begins obviously with the principals and superintendent. The superintendent recommends a budget. The board then approves a budget. It's not really approving a budget. They're really just kind of approving the recommendation for a budget because the budget is really just a recommendation when the board signs off on it. When you actually vote on the budget, you're really just voting on your recommendation for a budget. So the board does that. They issue a budget warrant calling the budget meeting, which is what we've historically held at the Oceanside High School auditorium. They also issue a warrant calling the referendum, which will be on June 14th this year. We take that warrant the next day and we post that warrant for the budget meeting in all 5 towns in 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 very conspicuous spots. Not on David's telephone pole, but we'll probably be at the library. It'll be at City Hall. It'll be at the Thomaston City Hall. It will be at the Gig Store in South Thomaston. It's at the Owl's Head town office. So we have certain areas that we post that. We make sure the budget meeting is called publicly. And then we also deliver all the referendum warrants to the towns, and then they distribute those to their counselors or select board to sign and return to us, calling the referendum. So we're telling them that we are calling a referendum. We just try to make it coincide with their referendum to save costs.
We also posted on our website
Yes,
all the information.
and it's posted online. We actually we put an ad out. We actually put an ad online in the paper. And Steve's always been great at making sure that the public is aware of it and with reminders when we get close. Those have to be, so we must leave at least 7 days between the board meeting approval and the budget meeting. We generally do a lot more than that. And then we have plenty of time to remind people. The referendum is held within 30 days of the budget meeting, and the referendum is the vote. That's the vote that we all kind of consider the budget vote. It's really just affirming a vote that was made at the budget meeting at the high school. The budget meeting is really where the budget's determined. The board recommends a budget. The superintendent recommends a budget. The board may modify that, changes the budget. The board recommends a budget. The board's recommended budget goes to the voters in a public meeting at the high school, generally, pre-COVID. And at that meeting, we go through the budget, and that's when everybody votes on each article. Every individual in that room has the same vote. Board members have the same vote as a teacher or a mechanic that works next door, or a student who lives in town who's home from college. Everybody has the same vote. Everybody has the ability to raise or lower amounts on the budget. It has to pass by a majority. It's run like a traditional town meeting. And what comes out of that meeting is our budget. That's the budget that we work with until the referendum validates that. The referendum has one question traditionally. Do you support the budget that was approved at the most recent budget meeting? That's all it says, yes or no, not the amount. So the budget meeting, the in-person budget meeting, is the meeting that determines what that final budget number is. It's a really important meeting. And we do try to make sure that as many people as we can get there as they can.
So the obvious question is, what are we doing this year? Because we don't have, I know the state in the previous years made some modifications and allowed it to be online. What is the current status of that?
The current status, as far as I know, is that it's got to be in person, that there's been no waivers made yet. Even last year, you had the option to do it in person. So budget meeting and approval, and a budget has to come out of that meeting. You can't just say no at that meeting. We stay until the budget comes out of that meeting. And the referendum, again, is the vote that we all consider the budget vote, but that really is just a validation, and that just approves the vote of the people of that night. If it does not get approved that night, if it does not get approved, if it does not get validated at the referendum, then we have a certain number of days to begin the process again. But the budget that was approved at that most recent meeting is our budget going forward until something changes. It continues to be a budget until we have another budget meeting, and something may or may not change.
One more time, the budget meeting date is June 14th.
No, the budget validation is going to be June 14th. The budget meeting is going to be probably sometime between May 16th and May 27th.
Okay.
And I got a little time out of the end.
Thank you.
But it's got to be within 30 days of June 14th. It can't be May 14th. David?
The budget approved at the meeting, not the validation. If it's not approved at the validation, if it's rejected, is it still the budget?
Yes. We have to operate with a budget.
It's not last year's budget. It's this. So what the heck is the vote on June 14th about?
Well, it has to, you have to get a positive vote, because if it fails at the validation, we have got to go back and redo it again. But until we do, for those 30 to 60 days that we are in the process of redoing it, we have to have a budget. And the budget that we use is the most recent budget meetings budget, not last year's budget.
If that budget does not pass, what budget is used after the 30 or 60 days?
Well, so the next budget meeting would have another budget coming out of it.
So you
Each
have another 30 or 60 days.
Yep. Well, you budget meeting, validation, budget meeting, validation, budget meeting, validation.
You can continue that on forever. Reject it and be rejected forever and still continue on a budget that's higher than last year's.
I would encourage you to go through main statute, because there is a mechanism to relieve that, but
You understand what I'm coming
Yeah.
through? It sounds crazy to me, okay?
well, John's
The
the only,
budget-
John's the only one here that's been through 4 of them for 1 year, I think. So
I'm not saying that's
they
gonna be
do
any
get passed
fun.
eventually. And it wasn't RSU 13.
No, I mean, I'm not saying that it just seems ridiculous that if the referendum fails, if the verification validation fails, that you actually still use it.
Well, it's because of the importance. It really goes back to Maine's town meeting, his history, and why those meetings are so important. And that's the budget validation piece of that is actually something that's unique to education. And actually the budget validation piece of the process is something that we have to renew. The public has to renew every 3 years. So the public could actually choose not to validate, to not go through the validation process and actually accept the budget that comes out of the budget meeting. Every 3 years, we put in, there's a question that goes to the public as a referendum question. Do you want to continue the budget validation process? If you say yes, we continue this process the way we described it. If the voters say no, we go to a process that board approves or board supports. The budget meeting happens, and the budget that comes out of that meeting is the budget, period, end of story, move on.
The whole process needs revision. That just doesn't, there is no way a district the size of RSU 13 can hold a town meeting legitimately. So, because there's just too many people I've been to a town meeting where 9 towns were in a town meeting, and they had 4 different gyms, 4 different essentially they were spread out all over the high school with a whole bunch of communication to do it. So to get a compelling town, the problem is that people think that the validation is the budget approval, and it's not. Yeah.
All right, let's keep
I'm
it going.
sorry, I apologize, I'm done.
No. Okay. So let's go back to what the cost centers are. So this is actually what we spend all our time talking about, referring to in terms of when we go through finance meetings, our monthly reports, we kind of track our cost centers, our articles, we call them. So we interchange the word article versus cost center. Cost center is the main terminology for this process. We use article because a cost center to us in accounting is the building. The Cushing School is a cost center. South School is a cost center. So first up, special regular instruction. Regular instruction includes what you would expect: elementary, secondary, pre-K education, alternative education programs, English learner language programs, gifted and talented, and after-school programs. That's the biggest part of our budget is regular instruction. Special education includes special ed students in regular classroom settings, in the resource room, and the teachers and ed techs involved in that. the self-contained rooms, which are life skills and our intensive support programming. Homebound or hospitalized students that we educate at their location. Special ed administration. Then we get into the services, social work, health, psych services and evaluations, speech pathology and audiology, OT, PT, and then this is special ed summer school that we are required to provide for students that need that. That's a substantial part of our budget as well, and a substantial part of our population, both in terms of numbers and complexity, especially complexity. MCST, that's Article 3, Cost Center 3. Other instruction, boring name for all of our clubs, all of our sports. And summer school, our general education summer school is in that article as well. We don't have any post-secondary enrollment programs or college programs that we pay for, but that's where it would come from. Student staff support. These are all kind of what we talked about as overhead, guidance, health, instructional technology, 504 costs for students. Improvement of instruction, instructional staff training, PD, library services, and all of our assessment costs. System administration, that's you guys, that's the elections, that's negotiations, that's superintendent's office. And that's the rest of central office is also part of that, which in terms of accounting for, we account for anything financial, all of our purchasing, public information would go there if we had that, all of our HR, and then district-wide, like infrastructure type technology would theoretically be coded there, but we code all of ours to instructional technology. School administration, those are the principal's offices. It also at high school includes graduation and accreditation costs. Those are broken out separately. Transportation and buses, not the cost of buses, the leases that we pay, but also general ed transportation. We break out as best we can special ed, our Midcoast School Technology runs, as well as our homeless student transportation. Again, homeless and special ed, again, because of the subsidy or the grants that are used to pay for some of those. We try to code as much to special education as appropriate, because that goes into our calculation for subsidy. And the facilities and maintenance, general maintenance for the district overhaul, custodial, then we have building costs and building maintenance, other operations, which would be any utilities, telephones. And then we have minor projects and substantial projects that we would code there. In general, one is more just repairing and replacing things with minor, and capital renewal, the major would be anything that renews or extends the life expectancy of a building. That's what we do there. Debt service, and this is debt that was previously approved at other referendums. This is the cost of that for the oncoming year only. And then all other, which traditionally was being used for subsidizing the food service program, but it's also could be used for transferring to other articles, the cost centers, or to raise money for contingencies. Those were our 11 articles, cost centers, and we'll continue to kind of talk about those and if you have questions about things that might go into certain areas, just let us know. But hopefully, having the handout will kind of be a good reference for anybody who has questions about what goes where. And finally, this is kind of go ahead.
Before we move on to the timeline, can you also talk a little bit about the contingency funds? Because we set up a couple of those, and think they're articles, but it seems relevant at any rate, regardless of the terminology.
So we have other funds. So in terms of, so we talked about, this is, we're talking about the general fund here. We also have set up funds, and there's a couple of funds that have been allowed by statute. One is a capital reserve fund. One is a fuel reserve fund. And in the past, well, we have funded those, and then we use those, the capital reserve, to usually pay for both minor and major repairs. That's where we'd see those coding. But what we do is we transfer money. We ask the voters if we can transfer money from the general fund, unexpended fund balance, to those funds to be used in later years. The other fund that we have set up is the fuel reserve fund, and that is for fluctuations in fuel costs that are budgeted. So we try to put money away to help mitigate any kind of changes in the cost of fuel that weren't anticipated. We also, with the most recent legislature, they created the ability for a school system to create any reserve fund that corresponds to any one of those cost centers, any one of our articles. So we can create a regular instruction reserve fund, a special education reserve fund, a transportation reserve fund. We're allowed to create those funds. We have to ask the voters to fund them, and we do that through the budget process. Through that budget meeting is when they're done, because they don't go to the referendum part of it. They're voted and accepted at that meeting. We chose last year to at least establish a special education reserve fund. And so we have asked the voters and got that approved to transfer any money left over up to a certain dollar amount from the general fund to those accounts to help establish them. We did not get approval to spend money from those funds. We have to, through the process, we have to ask the voters to allow us to move money there and to spend money from those. Although with the approval from the voters, the board still actually kind of gives their last, okay to what the money's spent on. Excuse me. Did that answer that? Okay. Timeline. So this is a quick, down and dirty, kind of really rough general timeline that we work on. Between Thanksgiving and Christmas, we begin talking about staff. We talk to the principals. They are verifying the staff they have on hand, open positions that they may or may not need, new positions that they may need based on things that they see in terms of either student population or complexity or programs that the board has determined that what would be beneficial or they want to see in the future budgets. In January, now what we're doing is we get requests from the principals and the directors for any kind of non-traditional, non-staffing needs, whether it be fireproof file cabinets, vehicles that we might need for transportation, equipment for custodial, new technology, infrastructure technology, usually things that are kind of non-traditional, not every single year, because we do put money aside in the budget every year for things like replacing chairs and desks in the so they don't, it's not something like that. They're usually unique and one time only, or every 5 or 10 years type items. And then we are beginning the budget discussions with the principals and directors. And during those discussions, Stephanie kind of really leads us through tying the goals that the principals especially have set for themselves to the budget, and to see how how some of the requests that they're making tie to the budget. And that's been kind of really a very helpful piece of this process to kind of tie it together. It makes sense too, because the goals of the building are the goals of the board, and the budget represents the cost of those goals. draft requested budget. So requested budget is kind of somewhat of a wish list, but we tend to temper that back. So you're not seeing everybody's, just kind of crazy wishes. We'll do that with finance coming up in February. Usually by March, we can get to the point where John has gone through, heard everybody's appeals, has talked to the board, kind of gets a feel of what the budget he wants to see looks like. And then he will present the recommended budget to finance and the board. And through this whole process, we're also, the finance committee and board will discuss the budget, discuss some of the requests, meet with some of the directors if necessary that the board wants to see, look at cross sections of types of expenditures, whether it be supplies or energy or substitute costs or anything else that might be either budgetary numbers or staffing related. April and May is when we look for the board to support and approve a budget that they recommend. So what comes out of the board meeting is a recommended budget. We sign the warrants. We post the meeting information. We send the referendum information to the communities. We have a budget meeting sometime within 30 days of June 14th. So after May 16th, we want to have at least a couple of weeks before the budget meeting or the validation referendum to schedule that, and then make sure that we can advertise and promote the budget that was approved at the budget meeting so that people are informed when they go out and they hopefully vote on the approved budget. On June 15th or so, we get results back. The board then has to meet again, and they have to accept the board has to accept the results. We also then issue warrants based on the approved budget, hopefully, about assessments based on those calculations, and we send those warrants to the towns so they can prepare their check runs that are due on July 20th for that first payment. Behind the scenes, I'm sending this all to them ahead of time, so they're seeing what we're doing all along, so the towns are not surprised. So, I do keep them informed, and we actually hopefully meet virtually the last couple of years to kind of go through and to make sure everybody's clear as to what they're looking at, so they can really use our numbers in their budget as well. And then we also then have to file our warrants with the state, as well as all the minutes for the meetings, all the votes, and we filed that with the state and then with our attorney, and then we start again. And it's 8 o'clock. That's all I got.
Pete, I just want to say that I just can't thank you enough for the effort that you put into this. Being on school boards since, for 15 years, I've never seen a better description of what we do and what we're supposed to do and how to get it done. Never, not even close. So I want to thank you because of all the work you do every day anyway for this district. And on top of that, putting together this great presentation for all of us. I just thank you so very much.
It was, like I said, it came from a conversation that Chelsea and I began to have, and it really made a lot of sense. And then when we talked to John about it, it just made sense. And obviously when you heard about it, you set this meeting up, and it's something, I personally believe that, we need to get as many people understanding what we do here, because we impact so many people's lives, their financial lives.
Everyone.
We really do. So it's, to be kind of perceived that we live in ivory towers, not listening and not understanding what people go through. I don't want ever be for us to be known like that. So to me, sharing information, being open, brutally honest sometimes is the style that I believe in. I think that we all kind of are on the same page with that. We've come a long way in the last 8 years, and I think that we're continuing to grow. And the budget process is different every year because it seems different every year. The style is different every year. I'm not sure if there's a right way or wrong way. There's always a better way. But thank you.
Thank you. I certainly recommend all of you on the school board, everybody, to download this document and save it to your hard drive or the cloud or print it out, put it in a binder. This is great stuff that I will refer to into the future, just like the presentation from Eileen King from MSMA in November, John and Stephanie, their presentation about our mission and vision in December, and this now. These are all just great documents. I really encourage you to keep them in a safe place and refer to them when need be, especially as we go through this budget process. Questions for Pete? Okay. You said it all, Pete.
All right, I guess so. That's either really good or really bad.
It's always a good thing, man. That was a good thing.
Well, thank you. I appreciate doing that. It was a good exercise for me to do also.
All right. So does that do it for folks? You all set? Okay. Thank you all. You're wonderful. Thank you, Pete. So great job. Thank you. Thank you.
Have a good
See
night.
you all in a couple of weeks.